Let me start off today's session by reminding that we acknowledge and respect the Guatemalan peoples on whose traditional territory of the university stands, and the Sami, as part of the Sami people, on whose traditional relationship with the land continues to this day. And with this land acknowledgement, we shift slightly different dimension of past injustices that will be introduced by Jonathan van Harmelen, who, as you probably all know, is a visiting fellow here working with the Past Wrongs Future Choices Initiative. And in his regular life, I'm sure maybe that's your regular life by now here, Jonathan is a PhD candidate at the University of California, Santa Cruz, looking at, in his dissertation, the role of US Congress in the incarceration of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. Today, as you might know, there probably looks more at the public discourse, media discourse, all these kind of issues, and you've seen, although still being a doctoral student, Jonathan's already well published. So we've definitely made a good choice recruiting here. Hello to you, Vic, and welcome back to the center, and Jonathan, the floor is all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Oliver. That's a fantastic introduction. I'm honored to be here, and again, thanks to CFJS for hosting me here in my time. And also I want to thank, of course, the members of Past and Future Choices who have been helpful with kind of formulating some of the ideas that you'll see in this presentation. So I want to start with this image here. This is an excerpt from the Manzanar Free Press. I'll give you context. Manzanar was one of the 10 implementation camps that were created by the US government starting in 1942. This was as a result of Executive Order 9066 and the forced removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. The military, the US Army, was the first group to kind of start with the incarceration policy, and then it was taken over by a federal bureaucracy known as the War Relocation Authority. So in the 10 camps, there were different newspapers. I won't be talking about camp publications as much, but I wanted to highlight this article in particular because there's this sense of globalness that comes out of it. So the lines I really wanted to focus on particularly is you have approximately 500,000 Japanese nationals are scattered throughout the world. A large portion of them are interned or live in relocation camps. So in 1942, with the U.S. and Australia into the Pacific War, you see this larger policy of forced incarceration and later repatriation of individuals of Japanese ancestry, regardless of citizenship status. And in particular here, you have this interesting line where you talk about the status of Japanese nationals vary from country to country. Some dozen Japanese have been interned in England. All Japanese in Australia and India have been interned. Canada, Mexico, and the United States have instituted removal of the Japanese from the Pacific area, and little is known regarding the extent of the restrictions placed on the Japanese in Mexico. And again, this gives this sense of kind of globalness that you get with the forced removal policy. To some extent, I would focus more on Latin America, but for the sake of this talk, as I've mentioned in the summary, I'm focusing mostly on the Anglophone countries of the United States, Canada, and Australia. And again, I wanted to also include kind of a land acknowledgement, so we acknowledge and respect the Guamani people on whose traditional territory the university stands, in the Sami, Esquimalt, and Masonic peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. So yeah, with that said, I'd like to go into the body of the talk. So where I started, or how I kind of came to looking at global views of incarceration, especially in media accounts, started with this article I wrote last year for Discover Nikkei. I'm a regular writer for them, and Discover Nikkei is the blog of the Japanese American National Museum. So it hosts a variety of different authors who publish on different topics relating to kind of global Nikkei, or the global Japanese community. And it's a quadrilingual publication. They have articles in English, Japanese, Spanish, and Portuguese, most specifically Brazilian Portuguese, and that kind of acknowledges the globalness of the community. So large communities, for example, in Brazil, in fact, the largest Japanese community outside of Japan is in Brazil. Communities in Latin America, in Mexico, and Peru, etc. The United States and Canada is kind of part of the Anglophone world. And I started with this idea of looking at these global depictions of Japanese Americans as it was seen in the Canadian press. So this was a two-part series that I authored about what were the different Canadian newspapers saying about Japanese Americans specifically. So what did they think about what was going on in the United States? How did they view Japanese Americans kind of as a group? And how does it reflect on the Canadian policies going on with regards to Japanese Canadians. And so to give you the general summary, I looked at, with this article, the Globe and Mail. I looked at some of the West Coast papers, such as the Vancouver Sun, the Vancouver Daily Province, some smaller newspapers in different areas like in Edmonton or Calgary. But in looking at the Anglophone papers, most of what I was looking at is seeing what did these authors or what did these editorials say about Japanese Americans? And surprisingly, there was a decent amount of positive views of Japanese Americans. Most of that in relation to those that served in the US military and were part of the famed 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which became very famous in the United States and was used later on as a political tool to help with Japanese Americans to have kind of to earn redress in the 80s, and also served as a part of kind of the campaign to allow Japanese nationals to naturalize and become US citizens. But also at the same time, there was also, of course, an overwhelming amount of anti-Japanese sentiment that reflected both in the US and Canada. And some of that I will go into the body of this presentation here. So that's briefly kind of the starting point of how I came to this project. Another article, which is one I wrote about 2 years ago, was this one called Lessons from a Different Shore, Portrayals of Japanese American Incarceration and the Redress Movement by Western European Papers. And I'll go into a more briefer summary of this because it's not as directly related. This goes more into the 70s and 80s post-war memories of incarceration and this fascination in Europe with what happened to Japanese Americans. And that adds to the general theme of this idea of what did media outlets see in talking about this story about Japanese American incarceration, and how is it represented, for example, of looking at internal politics or internal discussions of various topics relating to history of memory and history of kind of racist policies. One, for example, that I think would be worth highlighting is in Der Spiegel from 1984. I believe his name is Michael Naumann. He was later the Minister of Culture in Germany, known for in part helping create the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. He had written an article for Der Spiegel in '84 talking about California. I think it was called California's in the Heart, and talks and mentioned in great bit of detail about the incarceration policy and how it's very much representative of kind of the deep history of racism and how it related to capitalism within California. So to see that and to relate how it reflects on these ideas of memory politics is something that to some extent drives this project. So now I want to kind of more talk about these general themes about media and talking about the general themes of what will be this paper. It's a work in progress, I should say, and the questions from this talk I think will be beneficial with the final product. And the way I'll briefly just sketch out the outline of this presentation is I'll be looking at first Canadian, United States, and then briefly Australian papers, and what were their coverage of different policies. So either Japanese Americans, Japanese Canadians, the policies in Australia, and kind of trying to look at this, maybe not as much a network, but kind of this web of coverage of different forms of incarceration. So one thing I want to, of course, highlight is the theme of the press as a pressure group in advocating for forced removal. And to some extent, this has been already well documented by various historians, as some of the ones I have listed up here. And I thought, as Oliver mentioned, I kind of an old school bring in a book. This was a book from 1983, authored by Toyo Takada. I've been researching this part of my research here at UVic. And fun fact, he was actually from Victoria. He's, as his name indicates, he's related to the Takada family that created the Takada Gardens in the Esquimalt Gorge area. And just in this, as this book was published in '83, there's, for the chapter on evacuation or incarceration, he starts with this image here, where you see all the headlines of what was being said in the Canadian press at the time about the Japanese Canadian community being subversive, they're the enemy, they should be moved from the coast. And so in this book, and also Mine Okubo's Citizen 13660 in the United States, which was published actually in '46, she has a similar image there, where you have all these different headlines in the LA Times, Seattle Times, San Francisco Examiner, the Hearst Press in particular, showing how much the media was had this bearing on the image of Japanese Americans and Canadians, and how that subsequently affected to some degree the policies. So you have the press as a pressure group, and then also this idea of published accounts representing interests in both international and domestic policy. What I mean by republished is sometimes you had articles that were published by the Associated Press and then through wires would then appear in other newspapers, US, Canada, Australia, etc. And so I wanted to pull out a few quotes that kind of accentuate these themes of the press as a pressure group. So this first one here is from Jacobus Tenbrook, Edward Barnhart, and Matson. It's the three authors below. Tenbrook was the lead author on this book called Prejudice Won the Constitution, which was one of the early studies about the incarceration, or in term as it had been popularly used then, and looking at different fact forces that led to the incarceration policy. And he begins by tracing this long history of the media as kind of the key outlets to put, or the key force in pushing for anti-Japanese movements. So you have labor's most effective weapon against the Japanese, however, was the editorial pen. And the inevitable effects of arrests and spot raids, dramatically pointed up by the press, was to confirm the traditional image of the Japanese handed down from earlier generations and revived upon the outbreak of war. Now, in this case, Prejudice Won the Constitution, they speak only of the United States. But I would argue in some ways, this is indicative of what you would see, for example, in Canada as well, that in early press accounts, you had this in late 41, 42, this idea that there is this menace among the Japanese community, and this is a threat that needed to be dealt with. And the third point you have throughout the winter and spring, into the spring, until Japanese Americans were cooped up in concentration camps, a barrage of stories stressing the presumed threat of Japanese Americans to the safety of the nation filled the press and the airwaves. This is from Roger Daniels, one of the famed historians on Japanese American history, his book, Prisoners Without Trial. And then from Ken Adachi's book, The Enemy That Never Was, perhaps, again, one of these important texts within Japanese Canadian history, the false stories of sabotage at Pearl Harbor and all the richness and details and wealth of pseudo-documentation by unidentified eyewitnesses was repeated as a matter of fact. The Vancouver Sun, for example, quoted Secretary Knox's statement, Secretary Frank Knox being the head of the Navy at the time. And while this kind of indicates the importance of Pearl Harbor and what some US officials were saying, in the following paragraph, there's this vivid discussion of how, for example, the Canadian Legion thought these little things like these fires that popped up in British Columbia were being ignited by Japanese Canadians in celebration of the fall of Hong Kong, or these other rumors which were never substantiated whatsoever, but just became part of this this rolling effect of the anti-Japanese movement in Canada at the time, how that finally led to forced removal. And so, with all this idea about imagery of the media and also just the variety of media accounts, I also want to kind of give a brief timeline of events in 41 to 42 and how this kind of in these different contexts. So you start with, of course, December 7th, 1941, you have the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and then you have, as part of this greater movement or this greater operation, you have attacks on Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, Guam, Wake Islands. I would probably put Pearl Harbor as kind of being the center of this attack in relation to what happens in Canada and the United States. To some extent, of course, we can't forget that there were 2,500 Canadian soldiers in Hong Kong that surrendered on December 25th. But the attack on Pearl Harbor was a particular event that really spells a threat to, of course, the Pacific coast. And you'll see some of the imagery in the press how Pearl Harbor was kind of reused in both the US and Canada as kind of a threat to the security of both states, and also throughout the Pacific and Latin America as well. And so starting and before I finish this section on December 7th, it should be known that the Australian government immediately interns about 4,000 individuals of Japanese ancestry residing in the country. Under the White Australia policy, no individuals of Japanese ancestry could really become Australian citizens at the time, part of this long-going policy of exclusion. And so immediately after Pearl Harbor, the Australian military goes in and starts to do these large roundups. And most of that community eventually is deported as a result of these policies. Starting in January 1942, the FBI begins raids that result in the arrest of thousands of Issei community leaders, Issei meaning first generation Japanese Americans or Japanese Canadians. So thousands of these leaders are arrested and sent to internment camps operated by the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and in some cases, the Army. And then the Royal Canadian Navy impounds Japanese Canadian fishing boats in British Columbia, and then the RCMP conducts spot arrests So in comparison to the FBI, the RCMP does not conduct as many arrests as what's going on in the United States. But what I find interesting is that one of the members of the BC Security Commission that I mentioned towards the end was actually arguing for the creation of a similar, what was called an ABC list, where you rank people within the community as being under threat to the state of national security. So you have individuals that argue for a greater arrest, but some of that we'll talk about later. In February 14th, I'll also mention that the Canadian government asks or forces all individuals that are non-Canadian citizens, Japanese males, to be sent to work on road camps starting on January 14th. So this sort of this exodus that precedes what happens kind of in March 42. February 19th, 1942, the Executive Order 9066 is signed by President Roosevelt, granting broad powers to the military to remove any and all persons from designated areas. 5 days later, on February 24th, 1942, Mackenzie King signs Order in Council 1486, which grants Minister of Justice Louis Saint Laurent additional powers allowing for the removal of, quote, every person of the Japanese race. Now, something I know that's interesting here is on March 4th, 42, Ottawa establishes the BC Security Commission to supervise the quote unquote evacuation under Order in Council 1665. And it's interesting in the sense that it precedes what happens in the United States. I'll be talking a bit about which is coming first and who's directing who. Is Canada following the US in terms of policy, or is it vice versa? And then March 11th, 1942, the Wartime Civil Control Administration is created by the Army to implement forced removal. So something to note with, yeah, that's the United States. Thanks for asking this. So the US creates this Wartime Civil Control Administration. There's a significant gap of almost a month before that's created, and that's in part because policy is being determined. And to talk a bit about my research in Congress, there were several congressional hearings going on right after the 19th February to talk about what will happen if we incarcerate the whole community from the West Coast. So some of it's also delay tactics by Congress, by certain members of Congress, to figure out what's going to happen with this policy. So that kind of gives you the brief timeline that leads up to late March and April 42, when the US and the Canadian governments launched this large policy of forced removal from the West Coast. So now I'm going to talk a bit about Canada here and kind of some of the general timeline and thinking about some key points that you'll see in some of the media outlets. I guess I should preface this by including somewhat of a trigger warning of sorts, because there's a lot of racial language. So use of the word Jap or JP that's comes up constantly in the media at the time, which we now regard as a racial epithet. So several of the works that are important, I think, would be works like from Kanadachi, as I previously mentioned, and Gomer Sunahara. Patricia Roy's works of her trilogy, for example, on the anti-Asian movement in British Columbia, and her later book, The Triumph of Citizenship, are kind of look exactly at media accounts and how that played specifically just within the Japanese Canadian context. Of course, Jordan Stanger Ross, SUNY as well, have done extensive work, of course, on the Japanese Canadian experience. Greg Robinson, I also want to accentuate in particular because he's perhaps the first author or scholar to put all the different forms of incarceration, US, Canada, Mexico, together into kind of one dialogue. And that's in this book, A Tragedy of Democracy. And full disclosure, I work with Greg a lot on different projects. So when I wrote my article on the Anglophone press in Canada and their reactions to Japanese Americans, he wrote a subsequent article on the French Canadian press in Montreal and Quebec about the portrayals of Japanese Americans. And we kind of timed it in a certain way. So I came up first with the Anglophone, he did the French Canadian press. Starting in 42, the government, in April 40 or spring 42, the Canadian government auctions off the property of Japanese Canadians in the hands of the property custodian. And this policy goes on even until 47. The Ministry of Labor takes over following the dissolution of the British Columbia Security Commission in March 43. In February 1945, Japanese Canadians are given a choice to remain in Canada or repatriate to Japan, encouraging repatriation. Calls for preventing post-war Japanese migration growth throughout the war years, and Japanese Canadians remain barred from British Columbia until April 1st, 1949. And some of the points I want to bring up here is this point about how much is Canada following US policy, which is part of some of the dialogues we've had with the group of Passion Future Choices. There seems to be this assumption within scholarship that the Canadian government follows the lead of the US government, And to some degree, that is very much true, as King says here, that in handling the Japanese problem, we shall attempt, insofar as it seems desirable, to maintain a policy that, in a sense, can be considered part of a continental policy. And the situation in the US, in a great many essential, is the same as our own. And to the extent that it seems desirable, we shall endeavor to ensure that the policy takes account of the policy which are being applied south of the border. So this is in August 44. It's a famous speech where he kind of makes a declaration about what's going to happen with Japanese Canadians. And this is where he encourages for those who are loyal to Canada to stay and resettle in the East, or they found disloyal to repatriate or be deported back to Japan, or not back even, just to be deported to Japan. And I think in looking at to what extent that these media accounts from Canada demonstrate this replication or not of US policy, I think as kind of an anchoring point, the reactions to the Fred Korematsu Supreme Court ruling in December 1944 is one of those differing points, because it's then that the US government decides that we're not going, you can allow Japanese Americans to go back to the West Coast after incarceration, which was not the case in Canada. So with that said, I want to kind of briefly go through some of the articles I've been looking at and kind of give you an idea of some of the evidence that's kind of speaks volumes to some degree, and kind of talking about this comparative policy. So here we have a few articles from the Vancouver papers, the Daily Province and the Sun. I'll start with this one on the left here, which I find quite interesting. And the reason for that is you have at the top in this bold headline on the front page, "We'll move the enemy aliens from the coast. Ottawa announces a triple move to end the Japanese problem." And why this is unique in January 1942 is to some extent, you have some similar headlines in the United States, but not up to this effect. You did not have a full-scale movement policy going on in the United States. You had, as I mentioned, the FBI conducting the spot arrest of community leaders, but it was never announced in a sort of a full exodus of any part of the community, really. And so in this case, males of Japanese nationals that were residing in Canada, so those who had not received Canadians or were not granted Canadian citizenship, were forced from the coast and to work in these road camps. So sent from the coastline to be a part of this kind of labor policy. So in that sense, that's something. And then of course, there's also mentions of the fishing vessels that are being impounded. Now on the right, this is a bit later. This is kind of jumping on the timeline. This is August 31st, 42, the Vancouver Sun. And this is talking about policies regarding an ongoing exclusion even after the war of Japanese Canadians from the West Coast. And the line which I think really highlights the fact that this is somewhat of a global policy and kind of where does Canada sit in this policy is the paragraph on the right here towards in the middle. It says Vancouver's job is to lead propaganda in Seattle, San Francisco, Sacramento, and Ottawa and Washington to, quote, send them packing, make it a clause in the peace treaty. If the Pacific Coast speaks with a united voice, then heads of the allied nations will listen. You can wager that Los Angeles does not plan a welcome for their return to that city any more than we do in Vancouver. Now, it's fascinating to see that you have in this editorial a member of the Vancouver Press, or an editor for the Vancouver Press, saying that Vancouver should be the one leading this campaign. It's not the United States, it's Vancouver and the West Coast that should be responsible or for encouraging the sort of policy of ongoing bans of Japanese immigration and Japanese or individual Japanese ancestry from residing on the West Coast. So there's that. And so another thing to bring up in terms of looking at kind of global media accounts, this is in the Globe and Mail, and this was also reprinted, as you'll see, in the Vancouver Daily Province in the next slide. This is a column by Walter Lippmann. It's from February 12th, actually technically February 11th, 1942. And this is perhaps one of the most famous columns that Lippmann wrote. It's one that actually has been cited by several scholars and several government officials, pointed to this column as being why we should have an exclusion and incarceration policy. Lippmann was perhaps one of the most famous writers in the United States at the time. He was well known for having started the New Republic back in around 1914. So he had been regarded as this respected public intellectual, and even after the book, he was still to some degrees regarded as having a high status within US media. And here he again talks about this idea that the Pacific Coast is at threat, and there is a need to deal with the Japanese problem, as he would put it, specifically talking about Japanese Americans. But again, to point out, this is something that appears in the Canadian press in several outlets. Again, the Globe and Mail being the Canada's paper of record, and in the West Coast papers as well. Again, this is the, this is the Vancouver Sun, not the Daily Province. I apologize, it's kind of cut off at the bottom, but I thought using kind of the more visual one from the Globe and Mail would be perhaps to accentuate it. And the reason I kind of had the whole spread here is to briefly mention the fact that in addition to having Lippmann's column at the bottom, you have other articles that are kind of strategically around it that also talk about the issues with Japanese Canadians. So you have, for example, on the top left, talking about fishing boats that are seized by the Canadian government that formerly belonged to Japanese Canadians being used by the government as part of kind of a war effort. So either to be used by local fishermen as part of fishing, or in other cases, for example, for fireboat committees. So this idea that I will try to bring up again of how these articles are kind of nested right next to each other, and kind of how that creates this idea of kind of, here's what's being said about the US and Japanese Americans, here's how we should think about the Canadian policy. To some degree that comes up in Australia as well, but again, that will be a briefer section. These two articles are from our own Victoria Daily Times, the predecessor to the Times Colonist, and this again talking about the reprinting of different stories that are coming from other parts, for example, the US. This picture from the left was of something picked up by the FBI in Monterey, California, among Japanese Americans. It was supposed to be, I guess, a gun disguised as a knife. And while this is only one visual of this, there were several articles written in that were shared by the Associated Press that talked about these roundups happening throughout these towns in California, Oregon, Washington, where they would announce 1,000 Japanese nationals, or they would just say Japanese, which kind of makes this assumption that they're not really US citizens, they're just Japanese who happen to live on the coasts, and presented as kind of being a threat where there's this subversive activity going on. Again, kind of moving forward, this is during the war year, in the middle of the war years, when there's the incarceration policies occurred. Something to talk about briefly is this idea of how the incarceration policy is being handled in the US. This article on the right here is from November 43. This was right after there was what was described as a riot or an uprising in the Tule Lake incarceration camp. Tule Lake was unique because it was used as a camp for holding what were called no-nos, people that answered no to the loyalty oath issued in February 43. And there was a sort of uprising against the administration about mistreatment within the camp. And so you see these kind of visual policies of, oh, this is what's going on in the US, there's all these Japanese uprising. The bureaucracy that's running these camps are too soft, there needs to be military intervention. And this goes along with what was being said again in the US at the time about the Japanese Americans in this camp, that they're subversive, the government's going too soft, we need actual military force there to deal with them. I'll briefly move on. I just wanted to bring in this article briefly. Again, this is from the from the Victoria Daily Times. This was an interesting kind of reversion of history. I thought just to bring it briefly about how it was the Chinese that were the victims of Vancouver's anti-Oriental right, or the anti-Asian right in 1907. And in the description that James Morton gives here, there's this discussion of how, yes, the local whites attacked the Japanese, but they were more violent and vicious, and that the Chinese were really the true victims, and we should have been watching the Japanese Canadians even back in 1907. And so this odd form of historical revisionism, I think, is something worth noting. But again, that's maybe slightly beyond the point. Again, moving on with the warriors coming from this Tule Lake article I shared, this is where you start seeing discussions about what's going on in the US with exclusion and keeping the Japanese American community outside the West Coast. On the right, in particular, you have a Congressman, Claire Engel from California, who warned that the United States must never permit Japanese immigration after the war. There are now 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans in this country, and they provide a problem without solution. And this is someone who actually, fair enough, has been at the scenes of the quote-unquote rioting at Tule Lake. Now, put that against what you see on the left here from August 44, that's that speech that I mentioned at the beginning from Mackenzie King, where he talks about the coordination of US and Canada policy. So as it states here in the Globe and Mail, Prime Minister Mackenzie King said he felt that in relation to the Orient, Canada cannot do other than study the policies of the United States. And so this idea that the United States to some degree, or Canada follows to some degree what's going on in the United States, and that the United States had excluded the Japanese, Canada had not, and their trade had not entirely suffered. But there's this idea that there should be this ongoing exclusion, and following up on the rhetoric you would see on the right here, this need for ongoing exclusion later. Now this brings to this point I mentioned previously about Korematsu of the United States in 44. This again coming up in December 44, a few months after Mackenzie King's statement about this kind of loyalty versus disloyalty, and this reaction in the West Coast Canadian press to the court case in the United States. So as a part of Korematsu of the US, there was also a ruling called Ex Parte Endo, which resulted in the end of the exclusion zone of Japanese Americans. So starting in January 1st, 45, Japanese Americans can return back to their former homes on the West Coast. And the reactions you see here, I think in the Vancouver Daily Province kind of highlights the negativity or the kind of the anger that a lot of the West Coast racists had towards what was going on in the United States, that a ban is better for all of us. The US cancels the ban against the Japanese against the coast, and then the council to contact Ottawa, this is the Vancouver City Council, to contact about preventing Japanese Canadians from coming back. So there's this campaign that is orchestrated in Canada to keep up exclusion, and in reaction to what's going on in the US to not be like the United States. And so on the right, on the left, you see this is what local officials in Canada are saying in reaction to the United States. And on the right, you see here what Ottawa waits to word to start repatriation in September 44, I believe 45. No, actually, I apologize, it's 40. I think this is 44. But yeah, anyways. This is now coming towards the end. This is talking about resettlements. So the left here, this is the Vancouver Daily Province. I apologize for the resolution. When I was cropping these articles, they didn't turn out as well as I wanted them to. But as the headline states, there's this this argument that there would be riots that are feared in the West Coast cities of the United States if you were to bring back Japanese Americans. So again, to have this editorial talking about, or not editorial, this report in a Canadian newspaper about if you let them come back in, there'll be race riots, there'll be uprisings, there'll be chaos on the West Coast, even if an invasion of Japan is not even anywhere near a strategic threat whatsoever. It's all about domestic policies and keeping up with white supremacist policy of keeping Japanese Canadians out of the West Coast. And so looking down what's going on in the United States, there were to some degree actually instances of hate crimes that were being committed against Japanese Americans as they return. And this kind of ongoing movement of let us not be the United States, we should be different and we are not going to let them come back. And the policy is maintained until 49, as I mentioned. So it's spreading this propaganda that if you let them come in, there'll just be riots and there'll be it'll just be chaos. Now I do want to talk a bit about with this article here. This is from the Vancouver Sun by Jean Haworth, who was I believe she was a Baptist writer. And I bring this article into kind of contrast with the anti-Japanese press that's going on to show kind of what were the consequences and the negative reactions toward this sort of forced removal and exclusion policy on the West Coast. So people that dissented, which were a minority, but nonetheless wanted to put their voice out and call out what was the immorality of this racist exclusion policy. So this article talks about a Japanese Canadian who went to the United States, was incarcerated. He was a Reverend in Jitsuo Morikawa, who was a Baptist minister, went to Chicago, and is invited to come back to British Columbia to lead a congregation, the Baptist Church in, let's see where it says, it's Hawaii. Anyways, it's in British Columbia, and the final line that Jean Haworth finishes with is, he may preach the gospel in Chicago, but he may not chop wood in the forest of British Columbia. Now, I'm kind of uncertain the line chop wood in the forest of British Columbia, what that means. It's not preaching the gospel. I don't know if that's just a local saying about to live in British Columbia is to chop wood, but I found it quite amusing, but also telling that there's this calling out of kind of, you have this individual who's a good Canadian, the story of a British Columbia boy who made good, and yet is not allowed to come back to his own province. So that concludes kind of the Canadian section. And to kind of summarize, I think it shows on the one hand, we do have at the kind of the greater scale, kind of some acceptance of US policy and following that model, but you have these strong differences that come up, and that's in part, especially highlighted by the ongoing exclusion policy and how the media was important in kind of pressuring members of the Canadian Parliament to go ahead and continue with that. And sometimes, as I've learned from my readings, that members of the press worked with members of the Parliament, like Ian McKenzie, who was the representative from BC, was one of them, the most vocal members of parliament to push for an ongoing ban. So now we're moving to the United States here. Let's see how we're doing with time. Okay. Just to briefly kind of recap some of the important works, I think that talk about media would be the works of Roger Daniels, as I mentioned. Peter Irons goes into this to some degree. Greg Robinson, Eric Muller's work talks about it as well. And again, Jacobus Tenbrook, and then lastly, Nietzsche Wakeland. And then here, this is to give a brief summary of some of the events in the Japanese American case. So from 42 to 46, Japanese Americans remain incarcerated in detention camps run by the War Relocation Authority. In February 43, to be exact, a loyalty oath is issued to segregate those who could be deemed, quote, disloyal. Those who answered yes, yes, either move to separate camps or resettle outside the West Coast and the East Coast. Sorry about the typo. Those who reply no, no are sent to Tooting Lake, as I mentioned in that previous article about the uprising. December 1744, again, the Korematsu and the expert Indo rulings, the role of public opinion in camp policies, and then this question of the Bill of Rights and civil liberty groups as being kind of a factor in pushing against, for example, the West Coast bans. Also for challenging the exclusion order, so the ACLU, for example, was important as one of the legal teams that were involved in the Korematsu case. So again, to go into the US section, I asked this question to think about to what extent does the US view itself as a model for forced removal policy, and how does it view itself compared to Canada specifically? So here again, some examples of different articles that were coming out at the time. The one on the left, February 21st, right after the US issues its own executive order. There's fear of invasion voiced in Canada. The MPs stressed vulnerability of British Columbia. Quebec Premier foresees danger. The uneasiness stirs Ottawa. There's this idea of there's going to be invasion of the Canadians. The Canadian government is worried about this. In November 42, this is from the Chicago Tribune. You see the West Canada cures its jitters, so to speak. It moves this Japanese population inland. So you have this kind of racialized language that the Japanese are the subversive group, or the Japanese Canadians are a subversive group, and it helps that they're being removed from the West Coast. So kind of this leading language of sorts that shows this is actually a problem that needs to be dealt and was accepted by a large number of mainstream presses at the time. And then again, this brings up this, of course, later on, this question of the Japanese deportation issue that's discussed in Canada. Again, this is from 42. You have statements by Ian Mackenzie saying that there should be this removal of Japanese Canadians and this ongoing ban. I like this image here on the left. I don't like the person in the image. That's his name is Martin Dias Jr. He was a congressman from Texas, famous for running what was known as the House Un-American Activities Committee in Congress, later known for its famous anti-communist purges and witch hunts. That was more famously associated with Joseph McCarthy. Martin Dias was the ongoing leader of that committee for decades, and to give you an understanding of how influential he was, before 47, the heads of the committees were referred to not by their official titles, but by the name of the leading member of that committee, the senior member. So it wasn't called HUAC, or House Un-American Activities Committee, it was called the Dias Committee. And that was an ongoing tradition. It wasn't just with Dias, it was also with other committees. For example, the Tolan Committee, which oversaw this early committee in February 42 that looked into the question of what's going to happen with forced migration and incarceration of Japanese Americans. But as you see here with this image, you have this with he's pointing with the ruler showing this is Japan's plan to invade the West Coast. And it's not just the United States, he has Canada there as well. This idea kind of we need to be careful, and this is not just a US problem, this is kind of a global as well. And that would come up in rhetoric even within Congress at certain and different occasions about how we need to handle this policy. And then of course, this is from the Los Angeles Times. I thought it's, again, talking about the pairing of articles next to each other. You have this juxtaposition between what's going on in Canada and in the United States. It's to some degree, it kind of accentuates this chaos that's going on in Canada. I mean, to some extent it is. Some of it is, I think, what could be called fake news. That you have, there's just chaos. There's this rioting that's happening in Hastings Park, although the so-called uprising is immediately quelled. And then on the right, you have the army that's running this kind of evacuation policy and describes, oh, this is the amount that we're giving in terms of food and supplies to those that are incarcerated or confined. I put this in again to talk about this concept of Bill of Rights, and this is right in 46. This is after drafting the Saskatchewan Bill of Rights that precedes the 1960 Bill of Rights in Canada Act. The 1960 Bill of Rights in Canada that was drafted by John Diefenbacher. You have here discussions of the American Bill of Rights to be offered to Canada, published in the Chicago Tribune in May 46. And I want to emphasize this point here that Parliament has good reason to pass legislation for the adoption of a Canadian Bill of Rights in view of the powers. We have seen the creation of a Royal Commission to conduct a spy investigation and suspension of all legal forms. Later on, there's this discussion. If we have orders for the deportation of Japanese, there's no reason why the government tomorrow could not order the deportation of Canadians who park their hair the wrong way. This idea of arbitrary deportation policy, or really not, there's too much power given to the government with regards to allowing for deportation. Therefore, as Diefenbacher states, there's this need to have some sort of Bill of Rights. So, kind of as what could be argued as an American legacy, what is the influence of U.S. policy with regards to what's going on in Ottawa, or in this case, Saskatchewan? This is again commenting on different aspects of the Canadian policy in the U.S. You have here with the New York Times, there's this issue of deportation that's going on in Canada, and this discussion of what's going to happen with the ongoing bans and their ongoing removal. And on the right here, you have similar articles. This is in the Christian Science Monitor, which was republished in other publications about this idea of how fair was this policy. According to the Christian Science Monitor, there was some sense of it being somewhat fair, or that's at least according to the King government. Again, talking about this idea of an ongoing ban, and that there was this idea that some of it is allowed. Sometimes, depending on who you ask, that it was actually beneficial to Canada, and depending on which voices you spoke to, for example, the U.S. government, that there was this desire that by some members of Congress that there should be an ongoing ban, but that failed because of the Supreme Court's ruling with regards to ex parte endo. Now, briefly, I'm going to talk about Australia here. Australia doesn't factor as much, and I think that speaks to some degree the geographic differences. You see more sharing of publications or articles that are between US and Canada. And in this case, I'm looking at Australian papers that more comment on the US policy. And it's in part because of the nature of what Australia did by entering the community early on. You see immediately this idea that the policy had already been settled, and that's in part, again, like the legacy of the White Australia policy, how this, immigration exclusion basically said, we don't really have to worry about this. And I'll speak to that to some degree in a bit. So again, the keywords I think that are important to note here are by Yuriko Nagata, Christine Piper, Kay Saunders, and I mentioned here Marilyn Lake and Henry Reynolds. I was having a talk with Nilesh Bose the other day, and he'd mentioned their work, for example, on the global color line, which was this idea of different settler colonial states in the Anglophone world. So Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, and their emulation of, for example, of the White Australia policy and this idea of creating these isolated, basically white supremacist settler states throughout the British Empire. And so how some of the ideas you see here with regards to incarceration speak to some of the ideas that are brought up by Lake and Reynolds in their book. And something I would argue is that it's important to know Australia was a hub for internment of Nikkei across the South Pacific. So for example, the Japanese communities of New Zealand and the Dutch East Indies sent their internees to Australia for eventual deportation. So Australia served as a hub within the South Pacific area. And I would argue to some degree that kind of goes along with what was argued by C. Harvey Gardner and Daniel Masterson about this hostage theory. And so briefly to talk about that, Gardner discusses this idea of the US government creating this hostage theory. Michio Egon, I believe, talks about that as well, where incarceration was not just to lock up the community, but also to use national individuals of Japanese ancestry. Oh yes, also as Greg mentioned, New Caledonia was sent to Australia from French New Caledonia. That they were eventually sent to Australia and eventually used as kind of bargaining chips for Allied prisoners of war in Japan. Important to know that during the war, Australia actually hired Japanese American soldiers as translators, despite the fact that Japanese Australians who knew Japanese were interned. And of course, this was to some degree under the assumption that these Japanese American soldiers would return to the US. So in several accounts, you see in the community press these mentions of Japanese American soldiers stationed in Australia when they worked as translators for the Allied forces. And so another question to think about is, given the internment policy that happened so quickly as a result of, and also the later mass deportations, what interested Australian media in stories of Japanese American / Canadian incarceration abroad? So here you have two articles here about the Canadian case in Australia. So you see here that if they discuss, for example, Canada's possession of a fair sprinkling of Japanese, and some of them Canadian born, and this idea that you have this problem, as it says in the bottom right here, of Japanese Canadians being allowed to reside on the West Coast. And you have these again presented by different members of Australian journalists that are present in Australia. Sorry about that. Another article here that talks about kind of different policies going on in Canada. The right one's a typo. It's not the US, but Canada to use the fishing fleets. But also you have these, again, as mentioned previously, there's this quote unquote riot that happens in Hastings Park. And this is frequently republished in several newspapers throughout Australia. And I would argue to some degree, some of these republications show that this is why it's good to have an immigration exclusion policy, because you don't have these issues of having to lock up individuals of Japanese ancestry. So a very blatantly racist policy of arguing that this is the benefits of immigration bans. Again, talking about more about the kind of the policies of Canada's deportation policy, kind of falling in line with what, not to the same degree, but to some extent what Australia does. But interesting also to note that you have on the right here this discussion of civil liberties in Canada that was brought up by this Australian journalist that's in Ottawa at the time. This again kind of gives you a coverage of what's going on in the Australian press with regards to what's happening with Japanese Americans. I'm kind of speeding through this as I realize we're running out of time here. So you have ideas of kind of some of the press coverage that's going on. And the one on the right I want to highlight in particular, because there's this emphasis on unruliness by having this kind of lax incarceration policy, as some of those on the right would say, that they're allowing people to be released and that it's going to create disorder again. And you're allowing these subversives to go outside of the camps into the eastern United States. I'll just skip briefly. This is again kind of discussions of, but again, the comments against the US policy, which is perceived as being more laxed. The last article I want to talk about here, this is from the Canadian press on the left here. And I think it's quite telling in regards to the previous book I mentioned about the global color line. This is from the Vancouver Sun in 42, and it starts with, thanks to the quote white Australia policy, there are practically no Japanese in Australia, with their definitive and offensive strength gaining rapidly, Australians confidently as they won't be any charges in their Asiatic foreign policy except for Chinese allies. So in this way, I argue with this, putting this in the Canadian paper, it's almost in some ways praising what Australia does, that Australia has an alien problem, but it's not about, for example, with the Japanese Australians, it's more about Germans and Italians there. So it almost seems like they're saying that Australia dodged the bullet, so to speak. And again, it emphasizes that idea that of this kind of exclusionary policy and how some states admire those like Australia for maintaining this kind of white supremacist policy. And again, the one on the right talks a bit about the New Zealand policy and how, again, with this kind of hostage theory that you had different Pacific states bringing their Japanese communities to Australia. I think I'll wrap up here, but I do want to talk briefly about the Japanese, American, Japanese Canadian ethnic press. And why I want to bring this up briefly is that in the different newspapers, in some of the editorials, you see very much kind of a dialogue that's going on among Japanese Americans and Canadians about their ongoing experiences, that it's not just we're going through two separate experiences, there's actually kind of some sharing of information, not sharing of information, but rather sharing the stories of going through incarceration in different contexts, and how there's kind of a sense of a greater kind of Nikkei community press that's talking about forcibly incarceration. So you have this is just a kind of a list of some of the major papers that were in the United States. As I learned from my colleague Alicia, there was really no pre-war Japanese Australian press. Unfortunately, that's again, I would say arguably a product of the white Australia policy. We had such a small community. So again, you have these different presses in the United States and in Canada. Interesting to note with the New Canadian that it travels throughout and is briefly taken over by the BC Security Commission at one point. But again, as it mirrors what's going on with Japanese Canadians, it moves from Vancouver to British Columbia to Manitoba and then to Toronto. The same could be said about the Pacific Citizen, which is the organ of the Japanese American Citizen League. It starts out in San Francisco and then moves to Salt Lake City because that's where it's allowed to operate to cooperate with the governments with the exclusion zone. These are again some headlines from the New Canadian that talk about the exclusion orders and the curfews. Here it goes. You see here some discussions of the US and Canadian policies and some of the editorials. Some of these are wartime and some of these are post-war. The one on the left is from April 42, and it talks about the experience of the US at Mings and Ireland. Again, this is more talking about post-war, talking about some of the different policies happening, for example, with evacuation claims and pushing for compensation for those that were incarcerated during the war, and how that then relates to what's going on with Canadian policy with evacuation claims and giving some, not necessarily redress, but some sort of compensation for going through for what happened during the war. These are again headlines from 42, right before the incarceration happens, and right as the papers are closing. So on the left, they say, we will meet again in Los Angeles. This is some stories that were printed right before and after the war in the LA paper, the Rafu Shimpo. So this one on the left was originally from the New Canadian. It's an interesting little poem that was written right in March 42, right before people are going to be sent off to camp. Again, this is more articles that talk about the issues going on with Japanese Canadians, again, appearing in the Los Angeles press. And then one last thing I want to talk about here, and this is with regards to Australia. And again, I think it speaks volumes about how both Japanese Americans and Canadians saw what was going on in Australia as a very much, as it says in the bottom left here, it's a white country, that the Australian delegate to the Commonwealth Conference said late this week that his government believes in a white Australia will never permit immigration of people of color. In 59, right before Hawaii becomes a US state, there's this discussion that the Hawaiian statehood should affect the racial policies of Australia and New Zealand. So what's going on in the US and not just how it can affect perhaps, or what will be the effect, for example, in other states by talking about having, for example, multi-ethnic regions like Hawaii. And interestingly enough, there's an extensive quote by James Michener, the novelist, where he talks about what will be the lessons of admitting Hawaii to the 50th state of the United States. So yeah, I think I will stop there. I don't know if I went exactly over time, but to give us 30 minutes for Q&A, I think we'll go from there. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Jonathan. Really interesting.
Thank you.
This is a kind of a total babes in the woods question. I can't believe I don't know any of the answers to this at all, and maybe you don't know either because it's. But anyway, I'm just really struck by. I shouldn't be, but I guess, but I'm struck by the consistent violation in the coverage of what seem to us today to be very well settled principles around how mainstream news organizations handle the reporting of news in terms of, separating opinion from hard news stories, not using inflammatory language, corroborating sources, which makes me realize, of course, these principles would have been codified sometime after World War II, which then begs the question about were the discussions that led to the codification of those press principles entirely in camera among the relevant news organizations? Were these debates actually covered in the press later on? And would indeed specifically the coverage, the racist coverage and drumbeating for exclusion and incarceration, would they have figured into those conversations? And maybe you have no idea, I don't know, but this is what's kind of occurring to me here.
I mean, that's a great question. Thank you, Matt. I think I don't have an immediate answer to that degree. Where did they eventually set guidelines about? You said making a clear distinction between opinions and just pure reporting, just stating the facts. I mean, one could even argue to this day, some of this still happens if you look at Fox News, that they'll take a story and you can't tell the difference between opinion and fact.
Well, I'd say the recent reporting in the Canadian media about Chinese spying and compromised parliamentarians as well.
I would even say there hasn't been really a consensus about that to some degree, even to this day in terms of media. I mean, there are, like, for example, the AP guidelines, which I think does serve as kind of a bedrock for how reporting should happen. And that's been, again, that's what every journalist usually follows. And in fact, talking about with regards to language about interim incarceration, it was just this, I believe last year, that the Associated Press agreed to stop using the word internment or rather incarceration in the US case. So again, AP is kind of being a bedrock for some of those standards, but that's not everyone follows the AP guidelines always, especially if you can see, for example, the television program like Fox News or in the Canadian press at times, depending on which sort of news outlet we're talking about. I think it's important to note the legacy of the Hearst press, which was very influential in a lot of these discussions at the time. The Hearst press, as you know, there's this famous quote by William Randolph Hearst that you give me the papers, I'll give you the war, in terms of the US invasion of Cuba, and how that there's kind of that legacy that I will create the stories as I see fit to help generate a certain kind of policy. And again, the Hearst press, which was syndicated throughout the United States, was one of the biggest supporters of these anti-Japanese American policies. And of course, that kind of bled as well, and not just in the United States, but other places in Canada. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but
Yeah, sure, thank you.
If we go online, Greg, would you mind raising your question and maybe starting your camera?
Yeah. Here I am. Hello, everybody. Congratulations to Jonathan. I have first answering that previous question. Larry Tajiri and the Pacific Citizen led a multi-year campaign to get American mainstream newspapers to stop using the word Jap. And it was in line with the development of a set of journalistic principles, which, as Jonathan quite correctly said, the AP then picked up on. But the other question concerns Jonathan's discussion of the connection between Japanese Americans and Japanese Canadians. An important point to note is that in 1944, Larry Tajiri was invited to write for the New Canadian as editor of the Pacific Citizen, and he thereafter offered free any article from the Pacific Citizen to be republished in the New Canadian, and that then extended to the Continental Times and to other Canadian newspapers. And as I've often said in my biography of Tajiri, that's his gift was a gift that kept on giving, because a great number of American newspapers that have gone out of business and no trace remains of them, like Crossroads in Los Angeles, had articles reprinted in the New Canadian, and thus the only access we historians have to them now is via the Canadian press. There was a large number of articles from the Canadian press that were reprinted in the Pacific Citizen, and rather a large number from the Pacific Citizen that were printed in the Canadian press, and a smaller number from the Japanese Canadian press that were printed in the Pacific Citizen. And so there was no such transfer between US and Canada and Australia. So I think the situations of the two groups became much less known to each other because of that.
yeah. I can add a little bit to what Greg has been saying. Again, to bring up Takata here, there was the magazine in the United States called Nisei Review, which was later, I believe, became Scene, which was kind of the Japanese American community's equivalent of Life magazine. It was a pictorial magazine, these large spreads, and Greg and I actually wrote an article about one of the photographers, Toga Fujihira, who was later a kind of a world famous photographer who did work all around the world and worked with different film companies. But with regards to Scene magazine, Toyo Takata was the Canadian editor of the Canadian version of Scene magazine, along with, I believe, Larry Tajiri worked with it. Harry Honda was a member of the staff for Scene magazine. So you have these different Canadian journalists that are working with, for example, Japanese American journalists post-war as well. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you, Jonathan. I was wondering, in the US and Canada, did you notice in the coverage any discernible differences between West Coast based papers and East Coast based papers? Because you can imagine that West Coast, where they have larger Japanese Canadian populations, there would be more coverage than sort of like the Toronto Star. But yeah, I was wondering if you noticed that and what kind of conclusion.
No, that's an excellent question. I went through that briefly when I was writing the article last year about the Anglophone papers, and I kind of saw one of the distinct differences between, let's say, the Globe and Mail and the Anglophone Quebec press versus the West Coast press is the way they kind of focused on different points. It's not to say that there was a distinct lack of racism in the East Coast press. You certainly had some of those kind of portrayal, but it wasn't as consistent and it wasn't as pressing. You didn't hear as much about these need for an ongoing exclusion. In the Globe and Mail, I would probably say you had a wider variety of opinions and discussions about the Canadian politics in general. And I think even in the West, right before I came, I just wanted to look briefly at what was the Vancouver press saying about the Japanese Americans in the military. It's in the 442nd. There are very little mentions in like the Vancouver Sun, the Daily Province. Some of them actually, one of them might have here. I won't go back to, but just to say that it was basically not talking about the positive aspects of the regiment. It was mostly just this is where they are and they're going to have to face exclusion afterwards. But in the Eastern press, you saw more about this is the great stuff they're doing. They're really true Americans. And in some ways, you had some people saying that we should be emulated. So you had more variety, you had more positive statements. Now you did have some people that were more positive also from like Angus McGuinness, this BC member of Parliament, was probably one of the few voices on the West Coast who were against the Japanese Canadian incarceration policy. And he was one who was vocally against the deportation policy as well. There was one article in the Globe and Mail that talked about this debate McGuinness had between McKenzie and Mitchell, the Minister of Labor, about the deportations, and McGuinness criticized it and actually calls it a white supremacist policy in a statement. But then all the other members saying, you need to wise up, this is a wartime measure. We did it as fairly as we could. The US did the same thing, so we're fine doing it. So yeah, I think you probably got more of that debate in the Globe and Mail than you did in the Vancouver press.
Yes, thank you so much for a very detailed talk, and I have two thoughts / questions that emerged because of the talk. One is a continuation of some conversations we've had, and another is a more specific question, really out of a consideration of how this fits into Asian history of that time. So on that one, that latter point, I'm wondering if in the press, in the Anglophone press in the US, Canada, or Australia, if there's a lot of mention on the fall of Singapore in February 1942, which is really very important for India and for the changing politics of British Asia, and then later the internment of the Japanese in India and the way that the Indian National Army was understood in Japanese occupied Southeast Asia. So for the exact timeline of the internment mirrors how the Indian National Army functioned in Southeast Asia. So I'm just wondering if that was picked up upon, or if the Anglophone press in the West wrote about that. And then secondly, just as a continuation of conversations we've had, I'm wondering if you could give any speculative ideas about this relationship between the press and changes in policy. You mentioned Hearst, and I think in the US imperial historiography, that's an obvious line where we know in earlier cases how that played out. But in this case, I'm wondering if you could comment on that, and especially with the role of Canada and Australia, if there is a relationship that you can identify that is accessible through the sources.
Yeah, thank you, Nilesh. Starting with the first question, I mean, I don't know, I haven't gone through greater detail about what was going on with the Indian National Army and at least US or Canadian press accounts, what was going on at the time. And very little actually about the Japanese internment in India. I mean, that article in the Manchester Free Press, I was shocked that they actually talked about it. I mean, in terms of the fall of Singapore, that did weigh on, of course, I mean, in the West Coast as part of following the Pacific War and these defeats. I mean, one of the things that historians like Rocky Daniels has talked about, I think Greg Simber mentions it also in Bioder and Tragic Democracy, that these different battles in the Pacific War, like for example, the fall of Hong Kong and Singapore, weighed heavily on the idea of we need to deal with this threat now. And part of it's not just simply to actually deal with the threat. I mean, as that was later found in the redress movement, there was no real sense of military necessity in the policy, but it was more of an idea of looking busy, like we're getting something done. It's not necessarily a sound idea, and even members of the military questioned it internally, but that wasn't really well known at the time in public discourse. But nonetheless, that there was this idea that there's these failures that are going on for the Allies in the Pacific. this isn't a policy that will kind of work as a security blanket of sorts to dealing with this, even though again, not sound policy and actually, I think, work negatively for those respective countries. So, so to your other question about seeing this as in relation to policy, I mean, of course, I would argue in the United States in particular, you see it more vividly, this idea of the press having an influence on policy to some degree. So an example of that is with regards to that Tule Lake riot. Several members of Congress go and visit Tule Lake as part of these investigations. They don't really produce much, as a matter of fact. But nonetheless, they push, for example, that there needs to be something done about Tule Lake, that the military needs to be taken over, it needs to take over, it should be done under martial law, which happened actually before which actually happened right immediately after the so-called riot happened. And it became more or less kind of a political football that members of Congress used, and I would argue as part of their election campaign, so to speak, part of this kind of greater scope. I don't think it affected as much the later policy because with the bans, because there were some movements to kind of keep Japanese Americans out of the West Coast, but as again with the Supreme Court, that was something that really put an end to the policy to some degree, to a large part. And again, the U.S. military kind of going in step with what the Supreme Court ruled, kind of announced this is more or less an end to the exclusion. It didn't mean that people weren't suffering thereafter. I mean, there were several incidents of domestic terrorism in California. I think at least 40 where people had their houses blown up, shot at, etc., by these local white supremacists. So, yeah, I think in that, at least certainly within the U.S. case, within Canada, I think I'm still trying to figure out where it fits into some because you have the reporters, you have the editorial campaigns, but I think it's and to some degree it is clear, but I don't think as much in terms of how it really affects those immediate elections. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Jonathan. That was great. It's wonderful to see the sources you're working through and get a sense of the work that you've been doing. I want to ask a question that is to some extent unfair. So it's fine to say, I'll just think on this in part. I'm thinking of kind of the working paper and so on.
Yeah.
I think relates partly to what you've just been discussing in response to Nilesh. So how you're conceptualizing the role of so this is kind of first okay. So first kind of how you conceptualize the role of the press. I think use the notion of the web at the beginning.
Yeah.
And talk about the press as a pressure group. Mm-hmm. So I wonder, where you're fitting the press, and particularly in its coverage of this international coverage that the press is offering, what functions you think it's playing in this history. And I guess, so as a kind of relatedly to that, perhaps, you've taken us through the press coverage country by country. There's a lot of the material from each setting that you found, and some of that very interesting to me. This kind of cross-cutting coverage and so on. Yeah, but I wonder what would happen if you thought through the material instead thematically or functionally, something like that. So part of what seemed to be going on was at times sort of normative assessment. Oh, what they've done in Australia is really good, or perhaps what they're doing elsewhere is bad. Yeah, in some fashion. Another thing that seemed to be happening, maybe most obviously in December 44 or early 45 in Canada, was engagement of the question of common or shared policy aims in a way that seems different than a kind of normative assessment of, oh, that's really good what they've done with the White Australia policy. This was a kind of concern in the BC press that the Canadian policy might directly follow that in the US. And then you might have other, in the August 44 stuff, press interest in continental or common policy. So that might be another set. And then I wondered, why, for instance, the New York Times was covering the Privy Council decision in 1946. Where did that appear in the paper? Was that almost kind of like international matters of interest, international something like that? So there might be some other function that is neither, So I wonder if you try to think through the material in those kinds of ways rather than Canada
Yeah,
US, Australia, do you then get back at new ways of describing the function of the press?
yeah, I was actually, funny, I was thinking about thematically when I was putting together this presentation. I mean, I followed geographic terms because I've done that in previous cases. But as I was actually going through the research, I found in some ways it would have been easier, I think, actually to do it thematically. Now, I mean, I could have done, but I thought it would, at least in terms of this presentation, putting in the geographic sense would make it a bit easier, at least as in terms of presentation. But I think thematically, there is, I think, a strength in putting it that way. And that's something that perhaps maybe when finalizing this in the working groups, this discussion of, yes, you can talk about these geographic terms, but at some point there needs to be discussion of the themes of where do they agree and where do they disagree in terms of how they're presenting this information, and it's in service of what to whom. What do the editors get out by putting it in the paper? And you're very keen to note that for example, the article on the Privy Council, whereas it fit in the paper, it was more in the international section. Now, there were some cases where there was just a little article about it. It wasn't like front page news always, but there were instances, one, there was front page news. Not all the time, but sometimes you did have editorials, and finally something to talk about, again, talk about in place of the paper, of these different articles that you had some that certainly I think were surprising to find were actually more towards the front or more had kind of more central attention. It wasn't just a little kind of, maybe not a squib, but just a small little point that was just running in the middle, just to fill up the paper, literally. That was also kind of a concern about what do these sources mean? Are they just basically just filler for a broadsheet, or they actually carry some meaning in some way? And I thought that was the case, interestingly, with some of these Australian papers, that you actually saw, yeah, you had some squibs, like there's a riot that's going on in Hastings Park or Tule Lake, but then you had these very in-depth editorials, or these in-depth discussions about the Japanese American or the Japanese Canadian policy. So I would say that it is important to consider that, and maybe I should have been a bit clear in this presentation, but there's certainly several articles that were more than just, this is news of the world, this is what's going on. So I don't know if that answers all your questions, but those have been some ideas I've been thinking through as this project.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, shouldn't raise my question after Jordan, you picked up my inquiry, but maybe I can direct it a bit. Yeah, it's about the general issue of the role of the press in terms of its impact on the incarceration of the policies. You briefly commented on the relationship between the politics, policy making, and the press already. And I'm just wondering if you compare the discourse that you find in the press and in politics, do they map onto each other? Are they identical, or are there different nuances in terms of, issuing racial prejudices, white supremacist ideas? And would you agree? You just heard the idea that the press can set the agenda, right? Do you feel that was partly at stake, or did the main clues come from politics? To pursue exclusionary agenda? I'm not sure whether your material allows you to make any generalizations, but maybe you have some observations about how it's interplay between the world of politics and its media representation work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I can speak more authoritatively on this in terms of the U.S. case. I'm still, again, I think going through Canadian historiography, still trying to figure out where is the role of the press in terms of that. And at least to speak briefly about the Canadian case, I find it interesting that, and again, just the way Canada is set up with the dominion of these different provinces, that it's only in one province. It's a big province, but BC is the main province. You have, of course, some exclusion in Alberta and a little bit with Saskatchewan, these different policies, but it's really British Columbia. Fewer provinces certainly than 48 United States at the time, but you have it all consolidated on this larger West Coast, and that's where you get basically the debates are very much focused there to some degree. I mean, there's stuff in Ottawa, but you have a lot of it happening in British Columbia, and you do have dissent, but it seems that there's a lot of overwhelming voices in favor of forced removal, keeping up the bans until 48, 49. In the United States, where I'll speak more, I can speak more confidently about this, is there is cases where the press is kind of just directing the policy. Like you'll look in the congressional record and they'll pull up a press quote and they'll quote it quite literally and saying, okay, this is what they're saying in the New York Times, this is what Walter Lippmann said, this is what the LA Times just said recently. And that influences what's being said in Congress. And they'll point out how the diagram shows this is what's being said. And then conversely, there are times when I mean, not always, but there are times when Congress is kind of, you have they pull these quotes from members of Congress, and that kind of reinforces the agenda that these members of Congress have. Yeah. So I think it's, yeah, I think just to, I guess more to summarize clearly that you have several cases where I think the press, especially in pushing for forced removal, especially in early 42, that they play a huge factor in that.
Interesting. Greg, I think that's a new hand of yours, so feel free to start your camera again.
Yes, but the most important role of the press is actually before Pearl Harbor, with the buildup of what we would call today fake news. Endless reports about Japanese saboteurs who were going to poison their vegetables. Endless reports about Japanese American fishing boats, which were in reality Japanese torpedo boats for the Japanese Navy that could be taken out and refitted at a moment's notice. And this disaffected FBI agent, Lael Kane, placed all these sorts of fake stories, and the Hearst press picked it up, and then the reports about Japanese signaling ships, Japanese American signaling ships. So I think that the press plays an active role, and recently the Seattle Times has offered an examination of its own coverage of Executive Order 9066 and an official apology to Japanese Americans.
Okay, Anisha first, and then.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan, and I really appreciated the coverage of Australia and had learned a few bits and pieces there myself. And as an artist, and by some of the language, it was quite visually describing the situation. So, in terms of your discovery about Australia being exemplified as dodging the bullet in a way with its White Australia policy and being able to intern people quite quickly after Pearl Harbor. I'm curious to know if you came across much press in regards to the actual Australia, aside from maybe the Cowra outbreak, which I imagine quite a lot of coverage. How did they do the same way that they were treating Japanese in Australia?
That's a great question. For the life of me, I haven't been able to find really I mean, maybe it's something I just need to keep going through, but as many as I've been going through these databases, I didn't see as much coverage of what was going on in Australia. Like I typed in, oh, here's where love, I was trying to look at, for example, like Love Day, like looking at specific camps and where they come up, and there's just not a lot of any. I think that
maybe in and of itself, that's quite telling.
Yeah, I think that's quite telling too. I think there is a lack of coverage that was going on in Australia. I mean, again, maybe minor mentions that there was an internment policy. It happened, this is what Australia did. I don't think, and I think it's telling that there is that kind of lack of coverage that was going on. Yeah. No, but I was seriously going through, I was like, there's gotta be something, and it's just like, I'm hitting roadblocks. So, but yeah. I'll say, I guess, to respond to Greg's question about fake news, I mean, especially after Pearl Harbor, there's again, Knox makes this false claim that there were all these saboteurs at Hawaii, or fifth columnist, is like the best fifth columnist work that he had seen, which did not happen. And actually, Congress had kind of, at this tolling committee, pointed out that a lot of those claims that were made of fifth column activity really were instantiated. So there is a prevalence of fake news that's going on. So,
Putting aside, so I'm not too surprised.
yeah.
First of all, thank you. This is really, really fascinating. Thank you. I also want to hear more about India, but I'll keep that aside for now.
Yeah.
I know that wasn't the topic, and hopefully, let's just talk about that. So I'm curious about a little bit about the press's sort of influence. I'm sorry, I realized left, but the press's influence in terms of sort of racializing. You know, you gave us a trigger warning at the beginning, but you know, the incredible racialization and dehumanization that you sort of see building up. Both from what Greg was just saying about sort of fifth column rhetoric, but also just in terms of, you know, this notion that they can't be trusted to go chop wood in the forest or whatever, or vegetables or what have you. It reminds me of racialization of Koreans in Tokyo right around the time of the 1923 earthquake, right? When you had this horrific massacre of Korean residents in Tokyo. So I'm just wondering about that. In terms of how that sort of then parlays into not specifically internment, but more so the seizure of property, this sort of rationalization that it's okay because they've already been dehumanized, they don't deserve to have fishing boats or property or homes they don't deserve to be 100 miles, within reach of the coast. And I'm thinking in particular of actually, Izumi Sensei shared one of her, so I just, in my Japanese class, we just read her article in Japanese, and she explains that the profit that's generated from sales of all that property in Canada actually pays for the camps. And is not returned, right? And so I'm just curious if you can tell us a little bit about that, but also I have no idea about the US context, like did any of the money ever come back? Redress movements, that's a giant question, but maybe to focus on racialization. Great question.
Yeah. No, I think it's a fantastic question. I mean, in terms of the visuals, you could start, for example, with Dr. Seuss, who made this cartoon right before the incarceration policy of, and it's this line of these different Japanese Americans with a spyglass, and it's titled "Waiting for Orders" from, I think, Tokyo, but it creates this idea of them, it's literally they have individuals holding sticks and dynamite passing around TNT, and it immediately creates this visual imagery of the people, the Japanese American, the West Coast cannot be trusted. And there's all these cartoons in the first press that are extremely dehumanized and fit into kind of the racializations, not just in words, but in visuals, that kept on coming up throughout the war years. And I don't know if how many of those appeared in Canada, but they sure appeared throughout the United States, because a lot of these, again, cartoons were syndicated. So you had very much a visible dehumanization in visual terms, and you also had propaganda posters that I mean, and as John Dower talked about with War Without Mercy, this extreme racialization of the Japanese, either as US citizens, Canadian citizens, or members of the Japanese Empire, that there was this creation of this subhuman kind of caricature of anyone of Japanese ancestry. I mean, back to other visuals, is talking about, of course, the headlines, that you have this sort of language, again, I mean, using the epithet JP really kind of hammered in this idea of kind of, it's an othering of sorts, that they're not Japanese, they're JPs. They cannot be trusted. And that happens constantly. And to the point, again, you get this bombardment within the press. I mean, again, that's why I showed this picture at the beginning. This is what the headlines look like. This is the constant press coverage you're getting. So, there you go. So yeah, I think that certainly plays a factor in the dehumanization policy. Yeah.
One last question,
Commenting or adding to I think like Mark's presentation and also your presentation shows the selectiveness of what they choose to pose as a threat. And I'm actually interested in like the Toronto-based newspapers are not following this dispersal policy as a threat, and I think that's weird because people are like they're reporting, okay, that BC is kicking out the Japanese. Where are they going? They're going to the east.
Yeah.
And that's not in your presentation posed as a threat. So then what is the threat? So it's easy to see, okay, Japanese were dehumanized, and that's true historically too in other places, but at the same time they're not dehumanized in certain
contexts.
And this East Coast reaction to this Japanese exposure from West Coast, I think it's very peculiar that because like other states, you cannot bring Japanese, like you cannot make them freely roam around. Therefore, they had to keep the concentration camps.
Yeah.
But in Canada, they didn't do that. So I'm kind of curious why that was.
But in cases.
In like East Coast, especially small towns, like I think of my family, and when they settled in like Beaversville, St. Catharines, Grimsby, there are all these newspapers of like, we don't want Japanese.
Right, yeah, so we have got those papers.
I mean, but as I think again, Greg mentions in his Discover Nikkei post about the French, I believe on the French press, and also, well, actually more specifically in Tragedy of Democracy, he talks about there are a lot of problems and he said didn't want Japanese Canadians. I mean, McGill didn't want Japanese Canadian students, they didn't allow them to enroll. And I believe he says in Tragedy of Democracy that it's only Quebec that really is accepting of them, more so than Ontario, but certainly more so than Alberta. Yeah, but I mean, yeah, I think you do have a point to say that the racialized language is not as prevalent in the Eastern press. compared certainly to the West Coast press. So there is that sort of visual difference, of course, but that doesn't mean that's Ontario's
Yeah,
state.
I'm the same way with it, but there is more complex.
Yeah, it's more, it is a complicated story. I think in this presentation kind of simplify some of that, but yeah.
But I think, or I think you'd also see a difference, but like a huge difference between the Toronto Star, covered in Toronto, huge, even at that time, more multi-city than, you know, small town Ontario, where the like the local press was very anti anyone of Japanese descent settling there.
Jonathan, I think you got a rich database of material.
Yeah.
We want to see your book coming out soon.
Oh, God.
There's like no pressure, but I think hopefully you got a couple of good ideas that pursue this. So thank you very much for sharing this with us, and thank you for coming. Also online. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg.